Welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing amazing. I hope you're doing amazing today. This is going to be the final part of the fun little Rise of Augustus series by Kings and Generals. We got a little bit to go in this final part. We're going to be doing the Battle of Actium, and then, of course, what comes next. If you don't know, I'm not going to spoil it. Let's just get right into it, shall we?
A colossal force of 500 warships, 300 in the east, raging of the Roman Republic had begun. While the propaganda war had been raging, Antony and Cleopatra had moved to Ephesus near the end of 33 BC, where they began mustering their forces. Pulling together all their resources in the east, they had put together a colossal force of 500 warships, 300 supply ships, and 120,000 soldiers.
Like, that's insanely big.
The navy was mostly triremes and quinqueremes, also called threes and fives respectively.
Because of the layers of the oars.
But they also had a few heavier ships, ranging from 6s to 10s. These ships, thanks to their large size, were somewhat ineffective in naval battles, and were instead designed to smash the defences of fortified harbours, such as those at Brundisium and Tarentum. Though no source confirms it directly, the inclusion of these kinds of ships, as well as the size of the army, strongly implies what Antony and Cleopatra had planned.
To march on Rome? To march on Italia?
A full-scale invasion of Italy. With this kind of force, such a feat was certainly possible, but would be a huge logistical challenge. After all, alongside the 120,000 soldiers, their navy would have consisted of a further 200,000 men.
I mean, this is like D-Day type logistics here.
The key to their success would be maintaining a strong supply line from Egypt to their front lines in Greece, and then on to Italy. Already, though, some cracks were starting to emerge. Ahenobarbus and Sosius both implored Antony to send Cleopatra back to Egypt. Both were respected men, and Ahenobarbus in particular had proved himself as a talented admiral, having commanded fleets in the Adriatic for the liberators against the Triumvirate decades earlier. Both men considered the reputational damage of Cleopatra to be too much.
In terms of, like, I don't know, like, it's interesting. Yeah, Cleopatra probably should have stayed in Egypt, and I'm not just siding on this, but in my words, I would say that Cleopatra probably should stay in Egypt for one, to make sure the logistical train of supplies continues to flow. That way you have, you're not cut off. You have a connection point. There's nothing that could happen in Egypt. There's stability there, which is the foundation of this. And then, yeah, for the morale of the entire embarkment, there is a hierarchy that is very linear to Antony versus Antony and Cleopatra, who Cleopatra's not Roman, and there could be some, there should be issues there. Interesting, though.
Especially if they were to invade Italy. It would all seem to confirm Octavian's propaganda if the invading force landed with a foreign queen at their head.
Yeah, it would.
Nevertheless, Antony had a good reason for keeping Cleopatra with him. She was providing the vast majority of the funding for the campaign, as well as 60 of the warships, all of which Antony desperately needed to keep on hand.
But why does she have to be there for that?
Moreover, sending Cleopatra away may have potentially alienated other allied monarchs. Cleopatra also had her own reasons for wanting to stay. Not only that she had already invested heavily into the expedition, but there was always the threat that Octavian could offer to repair the marriage of Octavia and Antony, leaving
so she's suspicious.
Her isolated. In the end, Cleopatra, with the help of some well-placed bribes to other officers close to Antony, was able to convince him of her usefulness, and the force sailed for Greece in the late summer of 32 BC. Their army and navy were large and well supplied, and they had far more funds than Octavian did, all of which tipped the scales in their favour. However, rather than invading Italy immediately, Antony delayed. This was a rather uncharacteristically cautious move, and perhaps reflects that either the force was not completely organised yet, or that Antony was trying to avoid his previous mistake of rushing the invasion of Atropatene before winter.
Yeah, I mean, that He's wiser now, probably. And I mean, think about it. It's a logistical nightmare with this. Like I said, it's like a D-Day type force in terms of the age what we're in. But you're coming around from the Aegean to the Ionian. It might make sense to kind of like get a pit stop and then attack. But how long do you sit on your hands? That's the question.
Either way, he decided to bide his time, stationing garrisons along the supply lines in key places like Corcyra, Lucus and Methone, while the majority of the fleet put in at the Gulf of Ambracia, and Antony and Cleopatra themselves made for Patrae, where they planned to spend the winter months. It would prove to be a costly decision. Though Antony and Cleopatra had many factors in their favour, Octavian had a few advantages of his own, the most important of which
Agrippa
was his friend and right-hand man, Agrippa.
Yeah.
Having defeated Sextus Pompey around Sicily and led a successful naval campaign in the Adriatic, Agrippa was undoubtedly the most talented and experienced Roman admiral of his time, as was signified by the naval crown gifted to him by Octavian.
And he didn't even begin as a naval admiral. He began more like a foot soldier, and then didn't he like become one of the generals or something like that? And then he just took it upon himself to kind of like work towards the sea. And then of course the amazing just like engineering feat, I forgot what lake it's called, but it's on the western coast of Italy, where they're able to create a man-made harbor by instilling a canal that connected to a lake that you know, to hide the fleet building mechanism. It's insane, actually, just insane.
Octavian was well aware of his limitations, as well as the talents of his friend, and so was more than willing to allow Agrippa to take the lead in planning the campaign.
Yeah, I think that's how it's going to go for the majority of this war.
It was clear to him that attacking Antony's navy at Actium head-on would be ill-advised. Their defensive position was simply too strong, and the fleet too large. At the same time, Agrippa could not risk transporting the entirety of Octavian's army across the Adriatic with Antony's ships so close. Years earlier, Julius Caesar had found himself in an almost identical situation, with an enemy fleet thwarting his ability to cross the Adriatic in force, and had only eventually succeeded in doing so thanks largely to the incompetence of his opponents.
And the competence of Caesar being the Pontifex Maximus and knowing the calendar. I think that's right.
However, it was unlikely that Antony would be as clumsy, particularly considering that he and one of his lieutenants, Ahenobarbus, were veterans of fighting in these waters. Agrippa would need a more cunning strategy. Rather than confronting the enemy directly, he instead planned to slowly choke them into submission. In the
this is the setup.
early months of 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra moved their fleet at Actium in the Ambracian Gulf and began to rally their army there from winter quarters, when suddenly Agrippa struck at the supply hub of Methone. The precise details surrounding this crucial event are unfortunately somewhat scarce. However, small references and comparisons to other similar assaults have allowed modern historians to piece together a likely narrative. Methone was an important link in Antony's supply chain, and so had a significant garrison under the command of Bogud, the king of Mauritania, a talented...
Really, the king of Mauritania is all the way out here. Mauritania is in Africa, like on the west side of Africa. That's interesting.
And experienced soldier, as well as a one-time ally of Julius Caesar. However, it is likely that Antony had his best troops picked out for the invasion of Italy, so the garrison likely consisted of auxiliaries or irregulars, rather than legionaries. Given that any attack on Methone from the sea would require significant coordination and discipline, Agrippa, on the other hand, would have selected an elite force for the assault, likely consisting of roughly 50 ships with 5,000 heavy infantry.
So there was literally no chance for Mr. Bogud.
Considering how similar attacks were made, it is also likely that Agrippa launched the assault in the early hours of the morning, taking the garrison largely unawares. How effective this surprise attack would have been, and how difficult the fighting was, can only be speculated. Whichever the case, Agrippa's legionaries would very probably have had the advantage in hand-to-hand combat over whichever auxiliary force Antony had garrisoned there.
Probably knife through hot butter.
King Bogud was
Or hot knife through butter is the better analogy there.
killed during the fighting, and
Wow.
the city quickly fell to Agrippa. It was the kind of bold strategy that Caesar himself would have conducted.
So just like that, a very strategic point down the I almost said down the river, down the sea, has been dethroned.
Indeed, modern historians often consider it to be one of Agrippa's greatest achievements,
Wow.
and Barry Strauss ranks the taking of Methone as one of the most daring and risky attacks in military history.
Really?
The small amount
Why? Because of the the exposing like the strategy, or like is it just deadly in terms of like the risk?
of information that has survived about this crucially important event may well be yet another result of Octavian's propaganda that didn't want to credit his friend with having done too much. Nevertheless, the fact that we know little about the
Well, I don't know. I think correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I think Octavian is like pretty supportive of Agrippa. Maybe not in like the kind of way where you would have like a recommendation of like this guy should be a triumvirate or something, but I just from everything I've seen, he's definitely favored Agrippa.
The attack today does not change how impactful it was at the time. Through this one attack, Agrippa had stolen the initiative from Antony and put significant pressure on his fragile supply chain. Moreover, using Methone as a base, Agrippa, with roughly
Yeah, it's a launching base now.
half of Octavian's fleet, launched hit-and-run attacks across Antony's supply line, evading major engagements and fracturing Antony's supply chain.
Smart. Smart.
Due to the size of Antony's force, the impact of Agrippa's assaults was almost instantaneous. With their supply line back to Egypt cut, Antony was forced to demand large grain levies from the Greek cities, sometimes needing to use force to get them.
Wow.
Furthermore, Agrippa's constant harassment kept Antony's navy occupied, and after a minor naval engagement, Agrippa had successfully taken the island of Corcyra, allowing Octavian to successfully cross the 75,000-strong army and the remainder of his fleet into Greece, sometime in the spring of 31 BC. As well as the army, Octavian, cunning as ever, had brought with him many of the senators and equites who had not gone over to Antony. Octavian was taking no chances of being betrayed in Rome.
The proximity of all this is amazing, how close things are.
The fleet was docked near the mouth of the Acheron River, one of the supposed entries into the underworld, while the army encamped
My what?
of the Acheron River, one betrayed in Rome. The fleet was docked near the mouth of the Acheron River, one of the supposed entries into the underworld.
That's interesting. I'd love to see and hear about that lore.
While the army encamped around Parga, roughly 35 miles north of Actium. Meanwhile, at Actium, Antony had strengthened the position, with towers controlling the entrance to the Gulf and establishing a fortified encampment on the southern promontory. While this provided an excellent and well-protected harbour for the fleet, the area was not ideal for his army, with their little access to food and water and marshes with mosquitoes nearby.
Disease.
Evidently, Antony had only intended to use Actium as a rallying point for his army before progressing to the next stage of his plan, the invasion of Italy. Agrippa's aggressive actions had, however,
I never knew that this was the invasion of Italy, though.
forced Antony
Crazy.
to put this plan on hold. Even though he had dispatched numerous garrisons along his supply line, Antony's land force was still colossal, perhaps as many as 100,000, and it would still be weeks until the entire army could be gathered at Actium. Though Octavian had a slightly smaller army on paper, he had already managed to move his entire force, and even went so far as to draw up his army to offer battle,
That's crazy.
which Antony refused. The advantage that Antony had enjoyed just a few months earlier was rapidly slipping away.
That's crazy.
With few options available to him, Antony sent out skirmishing forces for the next 3 weeks, until the entirety of his army had mustered. Finally ready to retaliate, Antony established a second camp on the north promontory of the Ambracian Gulf, then closed in on Octavian's position and formed up his army for battle. It was now Octavian's turn to refuse, and Antony's forces began the process of besieging Octavian's force. Once again, echoes of the prior civil war between Caesar and Pompey can be seen. Just as Caesar had besieged Pompey's force in Dyrrhachium to try and starve them into submission, Antony besieged Octavian, attempting to cut off all his access to fresh food and water. Antony's fleet in the Ambracian Gulf controlled the surrounding waters, meaning that Octavian's supply line was now also tenuous. If Antony could cut Octavian off from resources on land and cut off his supply lines to Italy, he could force a land battle where his military experience over Octavian would really pay off.
Yeah, like we remember, Antony has years on Octavian, years. And in this case, it's really just an interesting thing here, because Octavian's military strategy and whatnot might not be the end all be all, because you have so much pressure to do something that whoever makes the first mistake might be the one that loses. So it's not really entirely on acumen of military strategy. It's really just about leverage here. How do you play your leverage? And how do you keep having leverage over your opponent?
However, Agrippa once again destroyed Antony's plans. He won 2 naval victories, one at Patrae, where Antony and Cleopatra had wintered, and one at Leucas, just south of Actium. Gaining control of Leucas allowed Agrippa's fleet to effectively blockade Antony's fleet.
And when you say naval battles, do we actually mean naval battles, or do we really mean like Marines, where they invade via the Navy, and then similar to how we saw downstream, down sea,
inside the Gulf, as well as securing Octavian's supply line? The noose that Agrippa had tied around Antony at Mid-Toni was becoming tighter and tighter, and as it did so, fractures in Antony's camp began to emerge.
Mutiny?
Senators such as Quintus Nasidius, a one-time follower of Sextus Pompey, defected to Octavian's side. Moreover, as Antony's forces were trying to besiege Octavian, Octavian had agents inside Antony's camp negotiating and bribing, eventually winning over Deiotarus and Rhemeticles, 2 Thracian kings, and their auxiliaries. Yet more desertions followed, and Antony himself was almost assassinated within his camp. Antony abandoned his plans and returned to Actium, but even this would prove to be disastrous, as disease began taking hold in his camp.
Well, let's just gloss over that real quick. He was almost assassinated. That's crazy. And I would imagine, I mean, this is just me just imagining, right? I would imagine Antony also had scouts and spies in Octavian's camp. Just how it went, right? It had to happen.
From posing a very real threat of being able to invade Italy itself, Antony was now faced with a broken supply line, a disease-ridden camp, and a blockaded fleet.
Morale's crumbling.
Around this time, Domitius Ahenobarbus, by far Antony's most experienced and talented admiral,
No. Him too?
also deserted him. Sick with a fever, he would die before reaching Octavian's lines, but his desertion was indicative of the dwindling morale of Antony's force.
Wow.
In an effort to regain control, Antony began enacting harsh punishments and executing those he suspected of disloyalty, but it proved ineffective, with the sources reporting that he was losing men every day to Octavian. Hoping to bolster his numbers, Antony sent the Galatian king, Amyntas, son of an ally of Caesar, north to Macedonia and Thrace to try and hire mercenaries, but he too—
oh my gosh, you just got a pitch battle at this point.
—deserted. Instead, Antony tried a different angle, ordering his new admiral, Sosius, to attempt a naval breakout. Sosius launched his attack on a foggy day to avoid detection for as long as possible, attacking the ships under the command of Lucius Tarius Rufus. Sosius' surprise attack was met with initial success, routing Rufus's squadron, but Agrippa was quick to react and amassed enough reinforcements to drive Sosius' assault back.
Dang.
By this point, likely August of 31 BC, Antony would have known that his position was hopeless. The size of his army and the composition of his navy all show that he had originally planned to invade Italy. Such a strategy relied upon him being able to keep the initiative and move his force quickly in order to not drain supplies. Instead, Agrippa had taken the initiative from him and kept his colossal force barricaded in one small area. Desertion and disease had already crippled Antony's force, and every attempt that he made to break out or force a battle had failed.
He's stuck.
Some of his subordinates advised him to abandon the naval campaign and make a break for Thrace and Macedonia with the army to continue the battle. Antony knew, however, that this was not an option. With the sea conceded to Octavian, Antony would be commanding an army with no supply lines and would eventually be picked apart. With growing desperation, Antony settled.
How old is Octavian during this time? I know he looks like he's like 18 at this point. I know he's not 18. He's probably, I mean, if I was to guess, he's probably like 24 or something. But it's insane how young and powerful someone can be in the age of, you know, the age where, I mean, if you think about the Republic, I think you have to be like 42 to be a consul. Now that's changed obviously, but it's just crazy to me. He had to have been known. People had to have been thinking him as like the Messiah, right? Like there's like it's insane.
On one final gambit. With his ranks thinning dramatically over the last few months, Antony recalled all his legions to the camp in the south, manned what ships he could, roughly 230, burnt the rest, and drew up his battle plans. Exactly what Antony and Cleopatra had planned at this point is hard to say. Some think that they were planning to break out of the blockade and flee, some that they were preparing for a battle, while others think that the plan was flexible, perhaps built around an idea of a breakout, but
yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens. I don't want to say anything yet.
Able to pivot towards a battle of annihilation if things were going well. An overlooked point, however, is that it was at this time that Dellius, later to be a historian, betrayed Antony and went over to Octavian, taking with him the battle plans.
Who hasn't betrayed Antony at this point?
As a result, it seems likely that whatever plans Antony and Cleopatra initially made, they changed them at the last minute, knowing that Dellius would have revealed their plans to Octavian and Agrippa.
I love this music, by the way. Amazing.
Whatever the case, on the 2nd of September 31 BC, around approximately 6 AM, Antony and Cleopatra loaded the treasury they had with them on their ships, gathered what was left of their navy, and drew them up in two lines across the bay. The first line consisted of 170 ships, Sosius commanding the left and Antony on the right, while the second line of 60
I'm guessing Cleopatra's on that ship in the back that's yellow trimmed.
Egyptian ships was commanded by Cleopatra.
Yeah.
In total, they would have had approximately 40,000 crew, 20,000 marines, and 2,000 archers. Our sources claim that Antony's fleet consisted of gigantic ships, while Octavian's were far smaller, a David versus Goliath situation.
Yeah, but I mean, the smaller ships are going to be way easier to maneuver in this situation. However, you're definitely going to have to give up ground because those big ships would just run you over.
This idea persisted for centuries, but modern historians, mainly thanks to the archaeological work of Dr. William Murray, now dismiss this as propaganda.
Oh.
Murray's research shows that while Antony did have some large vessels, ranging from 6s to 10s, as in the number of tiers of oars, these would have likely numbered no more than 30. The vast majority of the fleet was standard-sized 3s, 4s, and 5s.
Imagine if someone had a ship of the line out there.
Or triremes, quadriremes, and quinquiremes. Octavian's fleet, meanwhile, was mostly the same as the one that had triumphed over Sextus Pompey. Part of the reason for this fleet's success had been the size of their ships compared to Pompey's small vessels. In all likelihood, the majority of Octavian and Agrippa's fleet would have been comparable ships to Antony and Cleopatra's, triremes, quadriremes, and quinquiremes, alongside a small number of small ships called liburnae. Octavian's propaganda then overplayed the number of these smaller ships in order to make the battle more dramatic. This 400-strong fleet now stretched across the bay in front of Antony's forces, Octavian on the left and Agrippa on the right. The fact that Agrippa was given this traditional place of command shows that Octavian was relying upon his friend to win the battle.
I mean, yeah, and look who he's across from. He's across from Antony. So very important spot in this naval battle.
Octavian knew what his strengths were, and he knew that battlefield strategy was not one of them. For almost 6 hours, the two fleets stared each other down, each waiting for the other to make the first move. Eventually, Antony's fleet made the first move, advancing cautiously, while Agrippa, in response, bent the flanks of his line forward, forming a crescent formation that threatened to surround Antony's fleet. Seeing the danger, Antony ordered Sosius to attack Octavian while he brought ships from the center to extend his northern flank in response to Agrippa. In response, Octavian's ships backpedaled, drawing Sosius's ships further out of formation and tiring the rowers. Antony's line was already beginning to lose cohesion, a gap emerging between Sosius's forces and the center having been stretched to support Antony's flank.
That's one thing I don't really think about is, yeah, like you have stamina possibility. Sorry, you have stamina issues as a possibility of defeat because these people are manually like. However, these people they probably have really good stamina already for this type of thing, but it's just part of it. It's something you just can't forget.
It was at this point that the battle began in earnest across the line. Catapults and ballistas fired the first salvos, joined by archers, slingers, and javelinmen as the ships grew closer together, before finally ramming into each other. Utilizing their greater numbers, Agrippa and Octavian's ships would exploit gaps in Antony's line, and use multiple ships to attack one of Antony's vessels from numerous sides, grappling them in order to keep them in place. The result was almost similar to mini sieges, Antony's ships being assaulted from all directions and trying to fend off the attackers.
Not looking good.
Meanwhile, the lighter Laburnae of Agrippa and Octavian would dart among the larger ships, ramming when possible and quickly disengaging.
And see how Cleopatra and some of the Egyptian ships in the back just chilling.
Looking for targets of opportunity. It was a brutal battle, with neither side seeming to be able to gain an advantage. And then, everything changed. Cleopatra's squadron, which had so far not engaged at all in the battle, suddenly darted forward. With both sides engaged across the entire length of the line, Cleopatra led her ships through a gap in Agrippa's line unopposed and made for open sea. Antony, having seen the maneuver, quickly transferred into a smaller ship and followed in Cleopatra's wake. Many of Antony's ships attempted to follow, throwing various bits of weaponry into the sea to try and make themselves lighter. Some were successful, but others were surrounded by Agrippa and Octavian's forces and captured or destroyed.
This is where I was going to stop and talk about this. There's a conversation here. Did Cleopatra? I mean, this setup kind of like asserts that Cleopatra was kind of like precious cargo. Maybe there's the treasury also with her. That makes more sense, right? Having the treasury with her. But it seems that they were the reserve. Previously, I'd thought like maybe she just abandoned them, and this was like the fight, right? This was the fight, and she abandoned her. However, kind of like layering this video into my prepossessed thoughts, it seems that the writing was on the wall, and there was a conversation preeminently, most likely, that if something was to happen as such as this, to where it's going to be a toss-up or a loss, get out of Dodge, because there's so much more opportunity, not here, but back in Egypt. So that's probably what's happening.
It is often thought that the battle ended when Antony and Cleopatra left the battlefield, but in reality, much of their fleet continued the fight for hours afterwards.
That's crazy too, because their commanders, Cleopatra and Antony, abandoned them in the optics here.
In fact, they put up such stiff resistance that Agrippa and Octavian gave up trying to capture the ships and resorted to setting them on fire.
Dang.
Those on the lower decks were effectively trapped before suffocating in the smoke, whilst those on the upper decks were burnt alive or leapt into the water, where they either drowned or, at least according to Cassius Dio, were eaten by sea creatures. By 8 p.m., the battle
were eaten by sea creatures. Well, that means sharks, but because I don't think there's many other sea creatures out here that would do that.
was over. So why did Cleopatra do what she did? Our sources for Actium are thin, but the two most detailed ones, Plutarch and Cassius Dio, give damning accounts, the former painting Antony as a love-struck fool, and the latter dismissing Cleopatra as a coward. Both of these sources were pushing a pro-Octavian narrative.
Yeah, that was like my previous thoughts was that, but it seems that it was more about conserving what could be lost.
Cleopatra is rarely given unbiased treatment, Dio frequently referring to her as an accursed woman who fled the battle simply because it was in her nature as an Egyptian and a woman. This xenophobic and misogynistic view has led modern historians to be cautious of Dio's assessment and suggest other possibilities. Barry Strauss, for example, thinks that it is a certainty that Antony and Cleopatra had planned the move together. In his opinion, Antony knew that his situation was dire and that he had little chance of winning, so he committed to saving as much of the fleet as possible. If this was indeed the objective, then it would have to be said that Antony and Cleopatra were rather successful, saving maybe a third of their fleet as well as the treasury.
That's the big part, the treasury, which could be leveraged to fight another day. And in their head, they have some land forces still somewhere like towards Thrace, right? In the east. And in their head, they still have all these relationships that might be giving them a possibility of coming back. They don't, I mean, hindsight's 20/20, but for their foresight, they have a lot of cards on the table still, which they do.
It has also been suggested that Cleopatra was acting purely on her own initiative, that she considered the battle to be going against Antony, and rather than risking her ships needlessly, she made the decision to withdraw her forces independently. Antony then saw Cleopatra's squadron leaving the battle, realized that the battle would be hopeless without them, and so followed suit. Lastly, scientists have conjectured that Cleopatra's squadron may have been trapped in dead water, which prevented them from moving, and that by the time they freed themselves, the battle was already turning against them. And
I mean, that's a good assessment, but I think they were specifically held back for reserves. I mean, like I said, I think it's very precious cargo, not only Cleopatra, but think about it. The treasury. Why would you engage a boat that had the mass sum of wealth that is used to enact leverage in the future?
so they abandoned the battlefield. The truth is simply impossible to know for sure today.
Yeah, we don't know.
However, when one considers the strategic ability of Antony, the numerous breakout attempts beforehand, and the decision to lead the treasury onto Cleopatra's ships, Strauss's theory that it was a coordinated breakout appears the most likely.
I think it wasn't option A, but it was definitely option B. Meaning, like, let's see how this goes, but let's get out of here if it doesn't go the way we want it to.
In any case, Agrippa had won yet another crucial victory for Octavian.
Crucial indeed.
It is a testament to Octavian's mastery of propaganda that the months-long campaign waged by Agrippa to strangle Antony's forces is given little attention.
Amazing.
And that Octavian would be credited with the victory. In reality, the Actium campaign was Agrippa's masterpiece. Though fighting an enemy better funded and better supplied, Agrippa had managed to cripple Antony's gigantic force before it had ever taken to the battlefield, by slicing its arteries at Methone and elsewhere along the supply line. Every move Antony had made had...
So the entire Macedonian and Achaean Greece, let's just say Greece. Greece is under Octavian now? Every single bit of it?
Been countered by Agrippa until Antony had been forced to give battle on Agrippa's terms. Agrippa was, however, happy to allow his friend to take the credit. Agrippa was a military man, Octavian a political one, and though Agrippa had achieved the victory, it was Octavian who would be able to utilize it to change the course of history.
I'm pretty sure Agrippa was rewarded fairly here.
In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Actium in September of 31 BC, 2/3 of Antony's fleet was either captured or destroyed, but his army was still in the field. Antony's orders were for them to march to Macedonia and then cross back into Asia Minor. Antony himself, however, would not lead them, a testament to how slim he considered their chances of success. Octavian's army shadowed Antony's 19 legions, weakened by disease and lack of resources. Not fit to do battle, the army's leader, Canidius, gathered what riches he could and fled to Egypt, abandoning his men.
Wow.
With few other options available, the legions made a deal with Octavian, and the entirety of the army surrendered to him without a fight.
But Antony doesn't know that.
In exchange, Octavian spared all of the rank and file, and many of the equites and senators who had sided with Antony. There were some, however, who were too politically dangerous to be kept alive, chief among them Cassius Parmensis, one of the last two surviving assassins of Caesar, and Gaius Scribonius Curio. This last figure was the son of the Curio who had once served as one of Caesar's commanders in North Africa, and more importantly, of Fulvia, the ex-wife of Antony. Fulvia had proven to be a fierce supporter of Antony, helping to wage war in Italy on his behalf, and Octavian was not taking any chances that her son might follow her example. The mass surrender of the army did result in some significant problems for Octavian, however. Firstly was the large amount of allied Eastern rulers who had now fallen into Octavian's purview. Many of these, particularly the more insignificant ones, were deposed and replaced, while the more powerful kings, such as Amnitus of Galatia and Archelaus of Cappadocia, were allowed to remain in power. Octavian was sending a clear message that the East now had a new master, while avoiding too much destabilization in the region.
Yeah, I mean that's just a testament of Octavian's political prowess. Like, he has an ability that I'm starting to see, that he's diplomatically, where he lacks militarily, he is enhanced diplomatically. And I don't know what that is. That's what I was saying earlier. Is it because he's so young? Does his last name and his reputation just build a leverage of opportunity to be as detailed oriented and masterclass as he is diplomatically? And no, I'm not trying to be servile in any way here. I'm just literally looking at this video and thinking, wow, what is going on? He is just running through like he is just running through these decisions. It seems like he's making good ones. I mean, he's definitely failed in a lot of times I've seen, particularly like early on, but lately he's just been, maybe he has a really good counsel, and like, does that exist? I don't think that exists. Like, obviously you have, like, we're still in a republic, and I don't know, I just don't know. There's so many unanswered questions. It's just, like I said, like up here above my head, it says novice historian, because I am learning history, and I am not anywhere near knowledgeable on this stuff. But it's so interesting to me to see how different things have gone for the last 5 to 10 years in Rome.
The second and perhaps even more important problem was that Octavian now had tens of thousands of men that needed food, water, and just as importantly, payment.
Payment for, I mean, they're definitely on the tier, they're not on tier 1. They're probably like tier 4. But you got to do something with them, or they'll be rounded up and not be in support of you.
At least 4 of the legions were retained, but the rest, approximately 60,000 men, were disbanded and sent back to Italy. Octavian had for years been strapped for cash, and having failed to take the treasury of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium, he could do little more than make promises of payments to these troops.
Simply just like Caesar did.
He was well aware that this would eventually be a problem, and so Agrippa was sent to Italy, along with the veterans, to try and keep things under control for as long as possible. Agrippa, along with another of Octavian's close friends, Maecenas, were both given copies of Octavian's signet ring, allowing them to conduct official business on him.
Interesting. I didn't know what that is or what it is. So a signet ring, it's like the powers bestowed upon you can enact but executive action?
His behalf. With much of the hard fighting already done, Octavian probably left these two to maintain affairs in Italy, while he finished up operations in the east, ensuring that he would be able to take credit for the final defeat of Antony.
I mean, that's an interesting way to put it, rather than stabilization.
Agrippa and Maecenas had been given an impossible task, however. Shortly after the veterans' arrival in Italy, there were rumblings of mutiny. Agrippa, for all his popularity and success, was not the man who had made promises to the soldiers, and so they were forced to call Octavian back to Italy personally to handle the matter. Sailing in the midst of winter from Asia Minor to Brundisium, Octavian and his small escort fleet were caught in a tempest, sinking some of the ships.
Yeah, it's so risky out here, man. It's just so risky, like how things could change just by a storm.
By pure luck, Octavian was on one of the ships that survived, with only its rigging and rudder destroyed, and he made it to Brundisium a couple of days later. Octavian was reportedly met by almost the entire Senate, as well as thousands of equites, all keen to show their fealty. There were also thousands of the mutinous veterans. Octavian met with them and reaffirmed his promise of payment, as well as giving orders to parcel out various pieces of land to them. Communities in Italy that had supported Antony were displaced and moved outside the peninsula, with the veterans given their lands instead. Moreover, Octavian also went so far as to put up his own property for auction to help raise funds.
Crazy.
Whether anyone had the courage to actually buy anything from him is not recorded, but the gesture served its purpose, and the veterans were, for now, pacified.
That's important. That's important. The veterans really are the lifeline for the military pulse, right? Because a lot of people look up to them as seniors, and I imagine, I mean, there's a brotherhood there, so it all is related. Very important.
This was only temporary, however, and Octavian was now against the clock. He needed to take Egypt and the vast treasury hoarded there, or else face mass mutinies in Italy, which could be disastrous for his ambitions.
Oof.
Antony and Cleopatra would not, however, make this an easy task for him. In the immediate aftermath of Actium, Antony had gone to Peritonium in North Africa to secure command of 4 legions he had previously posted there.
And by the way, it's cold this morning when I'm recording. That's why I'm looking like I'm bundled.
While Cleopatra returned to Alexandria of 4 legions Antony had gone to Peritonium in North Africa to secure command of 4 legions he had previously posted there, while Cleopatra returned to Alexandria. Upon her arrival, Cleopatra immediately began gathering as much wealth from Egypt as possible, including stripping temples and bringing it all to her mausoleum in Alexandria, whilst simultaneously sending out envoys, desperately looking for allies.
And by the way, just to give some clarity, I know there's a lot of people that know this, but there's some that obviously don't. Her mausoleum is 2 stories tall. It's very interesting. We'll probably learn a little bit more about it as we go. The mausoleum has, it acts as like obviously a burial place. However, it also acts as like a storage place where you can amass the wealth, and that's what's going to be that's what's going to happen. And like I said, it's 2 stories tall.
Antony, meanwhile, sent messengers to the legions at Peritonium under the command of Lucius Pinarius Scarpus, who had served as legate under Antony during the Philippi campaign and had minted coins on his behalf, hailing Antony as Imperator. He was also a nephew of Caesar's, however, and thereby a cousin of Octavian. Evidently, word had reached Scarpus of his cousin's victory at Actium, and so when Antony's delegates arrived, requesting he hand over command of the legions, Scarpus had them executed, along with those in his staff who disagreed with the decision. When Antony appeared in person to take command, Scarpus simply refused to allow him in.
I'm surprised they didn't capture him.
Forcing Antony to give up the endeavor. Scarpus would be well rewarded for his betrayal, Octavian later appointing him as governor of Cyrenaica. For Antony, on the other hand, it was one of his lowest moments. A year ago, he had been one of the most powerful men in the world, capable of mustering
most likely, like, top 5 most powerful in the world.
Hundreds of thousands of men, and rallying dozens of kings to his banner. Now he was unable to take command of just 4 legions, and was humiliated by an old friend and subordinate. According to Plutarch, Antony was so depressed by the state of affairs that he tried to kill himself, but was prevented from doing so by some of the few friends he had left with him and returned to Alexandria. Whether Plutarch's claim is true or not is hard to say.
Well, he definitely tries to do it much later.
Plutarch certainly dedicated a significant amount of time talking about Antony's depression, including a report that Antony built himself a secluded pier on Pharos Island where he lived in solitude, emulating the misanthropic Timon of Athens. But some of these claims appear almost too far-fetched to be believed. If Antony did do such things, then it is possible, as American historian Barry Strauss suggests, that it was not an act of desperation, but instead propaganda by Antony to highlight how many friends had betrayed him, and to try and shame them. Whichever the case may be, Antony was by no means giving up. Both he and Cleopatra still had cards left to play. They built up what forces they could, including enrolling 2 of their sons into the junior ranks of the army, hoping to bolster support, and the ships that had survived Actium were prepared to continue the war at sea. The 2 also had contingency plans, one of which was to sail to Hispania and stir up dissent there, as the sons of Pompey had decades earlier, another of which was to build a fleet in the Arabian Gulf, which would provide a route to Egyptian allies in India if needed.
That's an interesting one. That's a real interesting one.
This ambitious plan was thwarted, however, by Arab tribes from Petra, who burnt the fleet on the instigation of Octavian's governor in Syria.
Wow.
Nevertheless, the couple kept looking for angles. Numerous bribes and assassins were sent to Octavian, none of which succeeded, but that kept him occupied and slowed him down. Moreover, envoys were sent to Octavian from Antony and Cleopatra together and from both separately. Behind Antony's back, Cleopatra supposedly sent Octavian a crown and scepter, effectively offering to become a vassal in exchange for her and her family's safety. Octavian accepted the gifts and publicly proclaimed that if Cleopatra abandoned her armies and kingdom, he would consider sparing her. In private, however, he made a separate offer. Cleopatra would be spared and allowed to stay a vassal monarch if she killed Antony.
God, this is crazy.
The latter, for his part, gave up the last of Caesar's assassins, Turullius, who had taken refuge with him, and offered to live in exile as a private citizen in Athens. Octavian promptly had Turullius executed and ignored Antony's other offers. Dio even claims that Antony offered to kill himself in exchange for Cleopatra and their children's safety, but it is hard to say how accurate this is. For Octavian's part, he still needed to tread carefully. The wealth of Egypt was gathered in Alexandria under Cleopatra's watchful eye, and he could not risk her fleeing with it, or worse, destroying it entirely. As such, Octavian was cautious to always respond to Cleopatra's appeals with various offers of clemency, and some sources claim even went so far as to send messengers saying that he was in love with Cleopatra.
Goodness gracious. Hey, I mean, she went for Julius. She went for Antony.
He would need to ensure that Cleopatra always had hope, up until the moment that he could seize control of the treasury. Plutarch paints a tragic view of the mood in Alexandria. Antony and Cleopatra disbanded their social group of so-called inimitable livers, and replaced it with the Society of Partners in Death. All too aware of the approach of Octavian's armies, the couple and their friends partied late into the nights, each one presumably counting the days until Octavian's arrival. Meanwhile, Cleopatra began testing numerous poisons to find the ones that acted the fastest and were the least painful.
That's insane.
Plutarch should be taken with a pinch of salt, but it is likely that his writings did reflect a genuine feel at the time. Everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before Octavian's forces arrived, and then it would be a matter of choosing to die on the battlefield or by their own hand. By now, Octavian was ready. To the west of Egypt, he sent Cornelius Gallus to take over command of Scarpus's 4 legions, while he marched a separate force of tens of thousands through Syria, planning to attack Egypt from 2 sides. Antony, in turn, marched his army with naval support to Gallus. Once again, he tried to appeal to the legions to rejoin him, but Gallus drowned out his appeals with a fanfare of trumpets. Frustrated, Antony attempted an attack from both land and sea, but he was quickly repulsed. In all likelihood, Antony's force was smaller than that of Gallus, and the attack was one of near desperation. In any case, Antony was forced to return to Alexandria empty-handed.
And Octavian's already in Egypt.
Meanwhile, in the east, Octavian's forces had taken the stronghold of Pelusium, an important strategic strongpoint that Antony had banked on securing his eastern flank. While some sources do say that Octavian took it by force, others say that it was handed over by agents of Cleopatra to try and ingratiate herself with him.
So many like there's like a flow chart of like, what do you believe? There's like the flow chart obviously of we have so many options and we must exercise as many options as possible continuously, and then we have instinct.
Whatever the case may be, Octavian was able to advance quickly and reached the outskirts of Alexandria just 10 days later in the summer of 30 BC.
Here we go.
As
I feel like I was just looking at this not too long ago. Caesar trapped inside with Cleopatra. Gosh.
at Actium,
like
Antony tried his best
like
to keep searching for new angles to victory. He led his cavalry out of the city in an audacious sally against Octavian's cavalry that were still exhausted from their march, routing them and chasing them back to Octavian's camp.
Finally a win.
Ultimately though, it was of little consequence, save for a boost to morale. Antony even went so far as to challenge Octavian to single combat, an offer that Octavian answered, saying that Antony had many ways to die. By this point, Antony had exhausted his options. Diplomacy and espionage had failed, the escape plan to India had been foiled, and he had been unable to amass more legions to his side.
By the way, let me know your context if you have any. What does the escape plan to India entail? Like, what happens when you get over there? Who do you know?
And the chances of him defeating Octavian in the field were slim to none. Nonetheless, Antony steeled himself for battle one final time and marched out of the city with what was left of his army and navy. In all probability, he knew that victory was next to impossible and had instead decided to go down fighting, taking as much of the enemy with him as he could. The forces lined up, Antony's infantry on the high ground, cavalry on the flanks, and the navy hugging the coast. Just before the battle was to commence, however, all of Antony's cavalry defected to Octavian.
God, y'all just can't win.
Leaving Antony with just his infantry. Still determined though, Antony ordered the navy to engage Octavian's ships, while he and his infantry fought against Octavian's legions. As the ships drew close, however, they too deserted Antony, raising their oars in salutation to the opposition. Antony and his infantry were quickly defeated and forced to retreat back into the city. Antony had been deserted yet again and denied the glorious end that he had probably been seeking. Upon hearing of the defeat, Cleopatra barricaded herself within her own mausoleum with the treasure of Egypt and a handful of attendants. Messengers were also sent to Antony informing him that Cleopatra was dead. Precisely,
And then that's when he wants to kill himself, right?
who sent these messengers and why is unclear. Perhaps there had been a genuine error, with people assuming that Cleopatra had already killed herself. Or perhaps Cleopatra had sent the messengers personally, possibly hoping that Antony would kill himself after hearing the news. Whichever the case, Antony believed the message. He ordered his slave to kill him, but the slave refused, killing himself.
Yeah, that is the most ironic. Like, it's not funny, but it's kind of funny. It's kind of funny. You can't say that's not kind of funny. That Antony, it's like, finally, death awaits me. Please kill me. And he kills himself. Like what?
Instead, Antony took up his sword and stabbed himself in the abdomen, but the wound did not kill him.
Gosh.
Badly wounded, Antony appealed to those around him to finish him off, but they fled the scene, the last in a string of betrayals and desertions. His cries of pain were heard throughout the palace, until Diomedes, Cleopatra's secretary, arrived with orders to bring Antony to Cleopatra. Antony was shocked at the news that his queen still lived, and was...
This is so, like, I've said this before in other mediums, but this is just reminiscence of Romeo and Juliet. I feel like Shakespeare derived inspiration from this story. It had to have.
carried to her mausoleum. With Cleopatra unwilling to open the gates,
Yeah, this is embarrassing, actually.
Antony was instead hoisted up and inside the as of yet unfinished building by pulleys. Cleopatra was apparently devastated when she saw him, tearing her clothes, scratching her face and breasts, and smearing her face with his blood. Antony comforted her as best he could and died in her arms. For Octavian, things were now incredibly delicate. Cleopatra was at her most vulnerable, and yet he needed to get access to her and the treasure before she could kill herself or destroy all the wealth. As such,
it wasn't the door like, or something, just like something was barricading the door or something.
He first sent a subordinate that Antony had been close with, Proculaeus, to negotiate with her. Cleopatra was clearly on her guard though, and rebuffed him. Proculaeus then requested the help of Gallus, who approached the gate of the mausoleum and once again engaged Cleopatra in negotiations. Whilst he did, Proculaeus took a ladder and snuck into the mausoleum with a couple of servants. They were spotted by one of Cleopatra's attendants, who shouted a warning to her, Cleopatra taking up a dagger to kill herself, before being restrained by Proculaeus. The queen and treasure of Egypt were now all in Octavian's hands. Cleopatra was effectively kept under house arrest in the mausoleum. She was also under suicide watch, with Octavian being careful to make sure she was eating and drinking properly. After about a week of confinement, Octavian met her in person, probably for the first time. What happened in this meeting is largely unknown. Cassius Dio says that Cleopatra tried to seduce Octavian with portraits of Julius Caesar on clear display to try and win him over. Plutarch, on the other hand, writes that Cleopatra tried to appeal to Octavian's pity, laying still in mourning with her self-inflicted injuries clear to see. Given what the ancient writers claim about the cunning nature of Cleopatra, either scenario is plausible. Octavian left the meeting assured that Cleopatra was intent on surviving the war, and would thus form a part of his triumph in Rome. This, however, had been precisely what Cleopatra intended. With his guard lowered, Cleopatra was able to smuggle in the means to kill herself. Precisely what this was is again unknown, with Plutarch and Cassius Dio both saying that no one can know for certain. Multiple early sources do, however, claim that she used venomous snakes to kill herself, smuggled in water jars or in a basket of figs. At the same time though, the sources are explicit that no wounds were found on Cleopatra, which in turn suggests she may have ingested poison.
Yeah, the other one's like a brooch or something that she had some poison in a vial.
In either case, she had sent a final message to Octavian, requesting to be buried alongside Antony. Immediately, Octavian sent men to stop her, but by the time they burst into the room, Cleopatra already lay dead along with her attendants, the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty.
Wow. The last pharaoh too.
The deaths of Antony and Cleopatra marked the end of the final civil war of the Roman Republic. The two hold a confusing and often contentious place in history. Antony in particular is often maligned as a drunk, incompetent and foolish, a damning assessment that does not quite stand up to scrutiny.
He was a great military man.
Soldier, he was a brilliant leader of men, demonstrating courage and clear thinking in disastrous situations, such as the retreat in the Atropatene campaign. As a military strategist, he was not comparable to a man like Caesar, but he was certainly talented and competent. The fact that he was one of Julius Caesar's most trusted captains is proof enough of that.
Oh yeah.
He was also an excellent politician. It is easy to forget that when the war broke out, hundreds of equites and senators, including consuls, sided with Antony, not Octavian.
And some of that could be true to that. Also, it could be traditional. Like, he's closer to the tradition, closer to the old republic.
Moreover, Antony was able to hold together the East and its myriad petty kings and leverage all the resources of the East against Octavian. His adoption of Hellenic and Eastern customs was used against him, supposedly showing him as being decadent. But in reality, it shows he was a cunning man who knew how to act the role expected of him. Even Cassius Dio, largely hostile to Antony, credits him as one of the greatest Romans of his day. He was of course a flawed man. He was a better military subordinate than the supreme commander, and though he could be creative and adaptable on the battlefield, his grasp over grander strategy was less strong. as shown by the Actium campaign. He argued,
I mean, I don't think that was very winnable, but maybe he could have created a better planning phase, but I don't know how winnable this was.
arguably also allowed his love for Cleopatra to cloud his judgment on occasion. It must be recognized, however, that Antony has been the victim of some of the greatest propagandists in history, first Cicero, then Octavian, and centuries later, Shakespeare, and so much of his true character may now be lost to time. Similarly, it is also important to note that Antony had the misfortune of going up against Octavian, arguably the finest politician Rome produced, and Agrippa, one of Rome's most talented generals. No one should be judged too harshly for losing to such titans, and against lesser opponents, Antony may well have been victorious. Cleopatra's reputation tends to swing violently from being viewed as cowardly, manipulative, and a conniving person to a nigh infallible political mastermind. The reality, as is so often the case, is likely somewhere in the middle.
Always.
By all accounts, Cleopatra was a cunning politician who used her position as Queen of Egypt to make her one of the most powerful individuals of her time. As queen, she was well liked by her people and managed to become one of the most successful Ptolemaic rulers. She was intelligent and creative, arguably outplaying Octavian in her final moments, deciding the nature of her own death. Ultimately, she was bested by Octavian, but once again there is little shame in losing to such an opponent.
Yeah.
Undeniably though, her power derived largely from her relationships with men like Caesar and Antony, using her charm, wit, and sex to draw such individuals to her and enjoy the benefits of their status. While such actions could be described as manipulative, it also needs to be recognized that such methods were one of the few ways that women in the ancient world could wield power. It could also be argued that while Antony was the source of much of her power, he was ultimately a poisoned chalice, and Cleopatra made an ultimately disastrous decision in tying herself too closely to him. It also needs to be recognized, though, that, as with Antony, the ancient sources were largely biased against Cleopatra, resulting in many unanswerable questions surrounding her and her true nature potentially being lost to time. What can be said for certain is that Cleopatra inherited a relatively weak position as a queen of a heavily indebted and divided Egypt, and managed to leverage her position to become a major player in world affairs, an impressive feat by itself. The deaths of Antony and Cleopatra left Octavian as the indisputably most powerful man in Rome.
In the world.
And in all probability the world.
Yeah.
The huge amount of treasure taken from Egypt allowed him to pay off all the debts he had accumulated throughout the war, and made him rich beyond measure. 14 years after the assassination of Caesar, the cycle of civil war
Oh. Shit, he might be 30 at this point.
wars that it had begun was finally over. It was a turning point in the life of Octavian.
Hold on, I kind of want to look that up, guys, so just bear with me real quick. Let me see. So this is like 30 BC. Octavian birth. Let's see when he was birthed. Augustus. He's about to change his name officially, right? To Augustus. The first sovereign, not first sovereign, what is it? First citizen? That's what they call it, the first citizen. 63. Yeah, he's 33 at this point. He's 33.
For the last decade and a half, he had been ruthless in his pursuit of power, leaving death and destruction in his wake. Now, having outplayed all his rivals, he could afford to be magnanimous and generous in victory. He could be Augustus. Though Antony and Cleopatra were dead, one major threat to Octavian's power remained.
What?
Caesarion. Though
the heir of Egypt.
Julius Caesar had never officially recognized the child as his own, he had allowed the boy to be named after him. Many did believe in his fatherhood, and Antony had publicly endorsed it. In all likelihood, these rumors were indeed true, meaning that Octavian was the adopted half-brother of Caesarion, giving Caesarion a possible claim to the now deified Julius Caesar's legacy. Moreover, though he was only 17, Antony had already proclaimed Caesarion the pharaoh of Egypt, and Cleopatra had him enrolled as part of the army.
Uh-oh.
These proclamations had been intended to establish him as a powerful ruler in his own right, but they instead painted a target on his back. Octavian could suffer no rivals, certainly not one who could challenge his position as Caesar's heir. In the words of Octavian's advisor, Didymus, "Too many Caesars is not good." The boy would need to die.
Yeah.
Cleopatra had
This is like Harry Potter.
already seen this coming, and before Octavian's forces reached Alexandria, she sent her son down the Nile, with the likely aim being that he would
You mean up the Nile?
eventually find refuge at the courts of allied kings in India. Precisely what happened next is not entirely clear. Dio simply says that Octavian's agents were able to catch up to him and capture him on the road. Plutarch gives a more tragic account. In his version, Caesarion is betrayed by his tutor, who lures him back to Alexandria under the pretext of Octavian, who would keep him as a puppet ruler. Naively, the boy returned to the city and was immediately seized. Around the same time, his stepbrother, the 18-year-old Antulus, the son of Antony and Fulvia, was also taken. He too had been betrayed by his tutor and had taken refuge in the Temple of the Divine Julius Caesar in Alexandria, begging for mercy before being dragged out by Octavian's men. Both Antulus and Caesarion were executed on the same day, just weeks after the deaths of their parents.
Crazy.
This left the three children of Antony and Cleopatra, the 11-year-old twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and the infant Ptolemy Philadelphus. Caesarion and Antulus, though young by modern standards, were men in the Roman world, and had both held positions of political and military authority. These three, however, were helpless, and Octavian knew well that publicly executing children would do little to endear him to the populace. They were, for now, spared. Octavian extended this same mercy to the inhabitants of Alexandria and Egypt, sparing them.
Well, then he needs them.
Many minor kings and princes of the east had been captured along with the city, and Octavian used them as leverage to rearrange some of the kingdoms in the east to his liking. While in Alexandria, Octavian also toured the city, including visiting the tomb of Alexander the Great.
Oh, is he gonna say the quote? One of my favorite quotes in history is this right here, if he says it.
When 33-year-old Caesar saw a statue of Alexander, he is said to have broken down in tears at the thought that, by his age, Alexander was the most powerful and famous man of his age, while Caesar himself was yet to achieve anything. One cannot help but wonder what Octavian, himself the same age as Alexander was when he died, thought to himself when he considered his own achievements. In any case, Octavian supposedly had eyes only for Alexander, as when the Alexandrians offered to show Octavian the tombs of the Ptolemies, he declined, saying, "I came to see a king, not corpses."
That's crazy, bro. That's just like, ooh, that's chilling. That quote right there.
The economic power of Egypt was such that Octavian was easily able to take vast amounts of wealth, enough to pay all his soldiers, debts, and more. This power also presented a problem though. Egypt was now an official province of Rome, which would mean that it would need a governor appointed by the Senate to rule over it. This would easily be the most wealthy province at that time, so whoever governed it would have huge amounts of power.
So you gotta get somebody that you know.
Enough to potentially threaten Octavian's position. His solution was simple. Rather than being managed by a senator, Egypt would instead be governed by an equites, picked by Octavian personally, and who would thus be subservient to him.
So decentralizing the power.
Effectively, Octavian would rule the province by proxy.
Okay.
This annexation of Egypt also marked a turning point in history. The Mediterranean had been the fighting ground for many great empires over the centuries, but now the entirety of the sea was enclosed by a single empire. The Romans would now start to refer to it simply as Mare Nostrum, our sea.
That's crazy though. Like, the only thing that's connected inland now is the Black Sea, and now that's got a target on its back probably.
Having settled affairs in Egypt and made a short tour of the east, Octavian began his journey back to Rome, returning there in early 29 BC. News of his victory and the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra had of course already reached the city, and the Senate had wasted no time proclaiming their loyalty to Octavian in as clear terms as they could. Hundreds of senators, including consuls, had flocked to Antony's side at the start of the war. Now they voted for any honours for him to be revoked, memorials destroyed, and his birthday declared a cursed and unlucky day. Simultaneously, they voted endless honours for Octavian, including celebrations on the anniversary of Actium every 4 years, and making his birthday a public celebration. Octavian accepted many of these, though he was always careful to refuse those that were too egregious.
Try not to be a Caesar.
Indeed, some of these suggestions were so outrageously extravagant that it seems likely that Octavian had agents deliberately suggest them in order for him to refuse them graciously, such as the suggestion that the entire populace of Rome should welcome him whenever he entered the city. If this were indeed the case, then it would certainly have been a tactic that Caesar, with his famous refusal of the crown,
That's what I was thinking immediately.
would have approved of. Most important among these initial honours were 3 triumphs awarded to Octavian, one for Dalmatia, one for Actium, and one for Alexandria, to be held back to back across 3 consecutive days. Octavian, masterfully propagandistic as always, was careful not to portray any of these as victories over other Romans, instead making Cleopatra and the Egyptians the focal point of the last 2 triumphs. During the Alexandrian triumph, an effigy of Cleopatra on her deathbed was paraded. Her youngest child, Ptolemy, does not seem to have survived the journey to Rome, but Alexander and Cleopatra had, and were made to march behind the effigy of their mother, dressed up as the sun god Helios and the moon god Selene, respectively.
It's crazy.
It was customary for the senators and consuls to meet the triumphant general outside of the city, and then lead him into the city. On these occasions, though, it was Octavian who walked ahead of all the senators and magistrates. It was a clear indicator of the new status quo, with Octavian as the first among equals. After the triumphs, huge games were held, and hippos and rhinos were displayed in Rome for the first time.
Whoa.
Furthermore, the doors of Janus, ceremoniously kept open during times of war, were also closed to mark this new period of peace.
And that goes all the way back to the beginning of the Republic. Way back.
Rome was in fact still engaged in wars with frontier tribes and kingdoms.
Yeah.
But Octavian was not one to let such an unimportant detail as the truth get in the way of a prime moment of propaganda.
Such an unimportant
Octavian
detail.
was also hugely generous with his newly amassed fortune. 400 sesterces, roughly a half-year wage for a legionary, was given to 250,000 citizens, and an entire year's wage to 120,000 veterans.
Does that create inflation, or is that not even a thing?
The civil wars resulted in a huge number of legions being raised across the Roman world, and by 29 BC there were as many as 60. Octavian had just over half of these disbanded, cutting the total number down to 27.
All right, so like 130,000, something like that.
And purchasing vast amounts of land to settle the demobilized soldiers, taking care to make sure they were widely spread out to prevent any one area becoming too powerful thanks to the number of veterans present. In addition to trimming the legions, Octavian also trimmed the Senate, which had swelled in numbers over the years.
Yeah.
200 were either expelled or pressured to leave. Any remaining senators were men who effectively owed their position to Octavian. In 28 BC, Octavian took the consulship for the 6th time, along with Agrippa. It would prove to be an important year in Octavian's career as he began to distance himself from the ruthless young man with divine ties that he had been for so long, instead crafting an image of a humble, generous, and unassuming statesman. He ordered silver statues that had been made in his likeness melted down, and took a particular interest in restoring and refurbishing 82 temples throughout the city. The great temple that Agrippa had been sponsoring, which was originally intended to be dedicated to Octavian, was changed to be dedicated to all the gods instead, and its rebuilt version survives today as the Pantheon.
That's crazy awesome.
Octavian tied himself even closer to Agrippa by having his niece marry him, thus making the two men related by marriage. Together, they embarked on a popularity campaign of sorts, quadrupling the grain allowance and giving magnificent gifts to many senators. They were so generous that, combined with their earlier gifts of money to hundreds of thousands of people, they inadvertently caused significant inflation.
That's what I was thinking.
Nonetheless, their popularity soared, and this same year, Octavian was voted the honorific title of Princeps Senatus.
Princeps Senatus. Is that the first citizen?
The first senator.
It's the first senator, okay.
This had been a traditional role within the Republic for centuries, but had lost much of its significance after Sulla's reign. Octavian effectively revived the traditional office and gave it a new meaning, more akin to first citizen rather than just the first senator. Most notably, during this year, Octavian and Agrippa announced that the national emergency that had been declared in 43 BC was now over, and the laws and rights of citizens were restored. It was a precursor for what was to follow. On the 1st of January 27 BC, Octavian entered the Senate to make one of the most important speeches in human history.
Human history?
He began by highlighting how powerful he was. He had all the money, the loyalty of all the legions, more power and influence than any man had ever had in Roman history.
Probably ever.
It would, he pointed out, be so easy for him to use just a fraction of those resources and seize power on his own in its entirety. He claimed, never wanted any of this power, but circumstances demanded he take up the mantle, and he did what was needed for the good of Rome. But now he had avenged Caesar and restored order. Octavian had achieved what he set out to do, and so he addressed the Senate as follows. The gods as my witness, I who have so many brave soldiers and devoted allies, who hold supreme power within the pillars of Hercules, who possess cities and provinces in every continent, at a time when there are no enemies abroad or at home, when you are all at peace, are strong and united and would yield to me, I, despite all of this, voluntarily and by my own design, resign so great a dominion and give up these vast possessions. The most powerful man in the world would willingly give all his power back to the Senate and the people, and retire as a private citizen.
Huh?
It was masterfully done. Some in the Senate knew Octavian's cunning, and knew what he was truly doing, but there were many who truly believed him. Out of these, some were genuinely disappointed, as they really did think that Rome needed one man at their head to govern them. The ones who thought a return to a true republic was best were just as nervous. After all, even as a private citizen, Octavian would still have the entirety of the Senate in his pocket, and would be outside the political establishment. Octavian had effectively checkmated them all. Whether motivated by fear, greed, resignation, or genuine support, there was only one course of action to take. In short order, the Senate unanimously implored Octavian not to retire and take power for himself. Graciously, Octavian refused, but the appeals kept coming until eventually Octavian gave in and allowed himself to be forced back into government.
What do you guys think about that? Do you think this was pre-planned, or do you think it was circumstantial?
The powers given to him in this first settlement, as it was now called, were extraordinary. Octavian would now, by law, be appointed to one of the consulships yearly. He was also given a 10-year governorship of an extended province that constituted the entirety of Hispania, Gaul, Cilicia, and Syria. Egypt would remain a special province governed by an equites appointed by Octavian. It was no coincidence that these provinces also contained the majority of the legions, giving Octavian direct control of 20 while the Senate had just 6. He was also to be awarded a new title. Octavian had initially considered taking the name Romulus to show himself as the founder of a new Rome, but upon deliberation he thought that this was too unsubtle.
So he did Augustus.
Instead, he would take a more unique title, Augustus, meaning revered one. The ruthless Octavian had forged the path to power, but now it would be the merciful and magnanimous Augustus who would wield it. From an outside perspective, it may have seemed that Augustus, as he would now always be known, had indeed largely restored the Republic. The Senate still appointed magistrates as they always had been doing, laws were proposed and passed in the traditional way, and though Augustus's powers were quite extraordinary, they had been legally assigned. In practice, though, Augustus ruled almost the entirety of the Republic. His power at the moment rested upon 3 pillars. The first was his position as consul, which allowed him to speak in the Senate, propose bills, and granted him legitimacy. The second was his powers as governor, which by extension meant control of the majority of Rome's legions, always giving him the subtle threat of military force if necessary. The last and probably the most important pillar of power was his network. This power was unofficial and nebulous, but it effectively consisted of all the gifts, political favors, patronage, and appointments that Augustus had made, which put anyone in any position of power in his debt. The Romans called this auctoritas, a combination of
What? I gotta see that. Very Latin. Auctoritas.
prestige and influence. In many ways, one could think of the Rome of this era as a shadow puppet. It looked and acted like a republic, but it was Augustus who controlled the strings. The republic was for all intents and purposes dead. The only real vestiges of senatorial power left were in the provinces Augustus had allowed them to govern, and in some of the more senior magistrate positions, such as the other consul. Even these, however, would eventually be stamped out. In 24 BC, Marcus Primus, the governor of Macedonia, a senatorial province, declared war on a neighbouring Thracian kingdom without Senate approval. The Senate put him on trial to answer for his action, and Primus defended himself by saying that Augustus had ordered the attack. This was dangerous. Augustus had no legal authority over a senatorial province, and the accusation threatened to shatter the facade and show Augustus as the sole ruler of Rome. Augustus flatly denied the charges, and Primus was found guilty of treason. Shortly after, the men who had led the trial were implicated in a mysterious conspiracy against Augustus and put to death. The whole affair had shown that while Augustus's powers were enormous, they were not quite universal. This would not do. Thus, in 23 BC, a second settlement was made between Augustus and the Senate. In this settlement, Augustus streamlined his powers and made them more universal. His powers as governor were expanded and made more flexible. He still retained power over the original provinces assigned to him, but he was also given authority over all other governors. Though men appointed by the Senate would still govern senatorial provinces, these governors would now be junior to Augustus, who could intervene in any province if he so desired. Traditionally, the powers of governors ended as soon as they crossed the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome. This was no longer the case for Augustus, and his powers as governor were extended to exist within the city as well. Lastly, he was given tribunal powers for life. The office of tribune of the plebs was, in the traditional functioning of the Republic, a rather junior one, but it held the important power of being able to propose legislation, as well as the ability to veto any laws. Augustus now completely controlled the Roman world. His extended and extraordinary governorship gave him power throughout all the provinces, and his tribunal powers allowed him to dictate politics in Rome in any way he saw fit. As a result, Augustus willingly resigned the consulship and never held it again, aside from on a couple of ceremonial occasions.
Because he doesn't even need it.
It was no longer needed. The office of the consul, which had been the most important office in Rome for centuries,
has now taken a backseat.
Was now almost entirely powerless, entirely eclipsed by Augustus's powers. Though he never took any monarchical title, he was now in every sense the emperor of Rome.
But when did that first be said? That's my question.
In 49 BC, Caesar's civil war had begun. Caesar's power over 3 provinces and command of 10 legions had been considered far too dangerous by the Senate of the time, who had demanded he relinquish his powers. After 5 years of civil war, Caesar emerged with even more power, and as a result was assassinated by the Senate in 44 BC. It had been an ironic twist that the attack had happened in the theatre of Pompey, Caesar dying at the base of a statue of his great rival. Now, 20 years later, the Senate gathered for every meeting in the Curia Julia, built by and named for Julius Caesar. In that building, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus presided as the most powerful man in the Roman world, with control over every province and 27 legions. Augustus had played the game perfectly. Whereas Caesar had arguably been too merciful and spared too many enemies, Octavian had been absolutely brutal in his pursuit of power and ordered the deaths of hundreds, including innocents. He had contended with some of the most...
Lepidus survived, right? Yeah.
illustrious figures of the ancient world, including the likes of Brutus, Cassius, Cicero, Sextus,
I
Lepidus,
thought Lepidus survived.
Cleopatra, and Antony, and emerged triumphant. As Augustus, there were now none that could threaten him. Powers beyond imagining had been voluntarily and legally given to him, powers that put even those of Caesar to shame. And yet, Augustus was hailed as one of the greatest Romans in history. For centuries after his death, people would pray that new emperors would be as blessed and fortunate as Augustus. Memories of what he had done to gain power faded, and Augustus's reputation became one of humility, piety, and wisdom, a reputation that he still holds today. His life was a masterclass in politics, and without a doubt he was one of the most talented, cunning, and clever statesmen in human history. When Augustus had begun his career, the Republic was broken. With his assistance, it became the bloody and tyrannical Second Triumvirate. Now, under his guidance, Rome had become something else again. The Roman Empire had begun. The next season of this series will talk about what Augustus did for the rest of his career, and how his extended
Link it in the comments. We got a whole nother thing to go, I guess. That's crazy. But nevertheless, this is it. We just did 3 back to back to back huge documentaries. Kings and Generals, amazing. Go subscribe to it. If you haven't subscribed to Kings and Generals, what are you doing at this point? I know, it's insane. I guess like we talked a lot. This is just insane, you know. Augustus, he played all the cards right. He seems that he is seemingly unstoppable. Either he has humility, or he is just following circumstantially into these situations. But that's backed up with tradition. That's backed up with his adoption for Julius Caesar. Like he stands on the shoulders of Julius Caesar, who stands on the shoulders of like Marius, and then just continuous, like it's a continuum. It's a continuum. He didn't just do it all himself. However, he did do so much by himself. He was strategically tactical when it comes to major decisions, such as Agrippa, such as aligning himself, such as being brutal in some cases, the proscriptions, the wars, the alignment. I leave you with one question. When did emperor become an actual title? Officially, not unofficially, like all intents and purposes, is that honorably, like, when did that actually become in the zeitgeist of Rome? When did the monarchical dynastic lineage from Augustus to his children to so forth, and how that rolls, how did that come about? Maybe there's videos we have to watch. Let me know below. Give me some context that might have been missed. Appreciate you guys as always. Peace out. Have a good day.